Hello and welcome to episode 88 of Linux After Dark. I'm Joe.
I'm Chris.
I'm Gary.
And I'm May.
Welcome back all. What is the one thing that you only do with a GUI and the one thing that you only do with the command line? And I don't mean things like web browsing and photo editing, which you can only really do with a GUI. Although I suppose there are web browsers for the terminal. But what I mean is something that you could do either way, but you only ever do one way.
For me, I might have an awfully weird one considering, I guess, my background. I only edit code and massive software projects in Visual Studio Code graphically.
Don't think that's that unusual, is it?
I mean, you'd expect, I guess, Emacs or Vim or Vi or some config thereof. I think that a lot of people who do like the massive Linux development project thing do it in a terminal, especially if they're working on Debian or something where they actually need to email in patches all the time, and using Thunderbird as an MUA for the Debian mailing list is a pain.
See, I used to work with a guy who would edit all of his code in VI and would just have full screen on an external monitor for tiled VI windows, and we all thought it was incredibly strange. Particularly because most of the time he was editing Ansible or Terraform or something and just didn't want any syntax highlighting. He had all that turned off. It was just 4 white on black text editors.
Oh, that's hardcore. I respect that.
I know, we all thought that Max was a little bit crazy, but it turns out that he just didn't want any of this new nonsense.
There was a time where I edited code in gedit. I mean, you can turn gedit at the time into a pretty competent editor. It had a file browser in it. It had a built-in terminal. It's like all you need, right? I didn't turn on any syntax highlighting. I didn't have any language servers or anything. I was just raw editing Python and hoping it worked every time I ran it.
I tend to use Nano for config files and stuff. I don't do any coding, but text editing, obviously not word processing. I use a GUI for that, but just basic text editing, I tend to favor Nano.
That I agree with.
Yeah, I used to do that until I got out of the habit of editing files on a box like a caveman.
Yeah, Mr. Cloud.
It's interesting because this one popped into my head and I flip between the two things. I mostly use Vim at work, and because I've had to use it a lot more day to day than I used to, because it's a full-time job, some of the power features I've got used to because it's so keyboard driven. Like I need to indent 4 spaces, the visual editor, to select a vertical line and hit space 4 times and then press escape to do all of the other ones I just selected is really quick now. And I've been doing that a lot for code snippets for documentation. But the documentation overall, I'm using Pluma, which is the graphical text editor that comes with Mate, a bit sometimes, because I can use the find and replace to redact things or change things. So I'm really not like fixed. It's funny that you say about VS Code, because we were looking at work this week at the Stack Overflow survey. And of course, it's a very broad spread, but VS Code is 74% of the professional developers polled. Visual Studio is 29%. Then you've got IntelliJ, Notepad++, then Vim. To get to Emacs, it's 3.9%.
Sorry, who is using Notepad++ as their IDE?
I know these people.
It's people on Windows that want to be able to set Unix line endings and aren't really thinking much more than that, I think.
Notepad does support Unix line endings now. You don't need another program for it anymore.
Yeah, it's done that for a really long time, hasn't it? Like at least 5 or 6 years.
But old habits die hard, right? I mean, you can't ask a bar chart who the people are, unfortunately. But if you're out there, maybe some of the listeners use Notepad++ and they will staunchly defend it, but I very much doubt it.
They're all running Notepad++ in wine. That's what we really know.
I was going to say that I think me and Joe are the same, but maybe all of us. I never use graphical updaters, ever, for package management. I think that's just because I can't bear it. It reminds me too much of what I got away from with Windows. I think I've said many a time, I want to be able to press escape or Control-Alt function key and get what's going on for real. I don't like the graphical version of it. And Gary, you were saying recently about upgrading Ubuntu in place with the graphical updater and it just freezing.
I just kept asking me to force quit. Yeah, it was ridiculous.
Yeah, so I never, even when I was playing around with Plasma, I never used Discover. I really didn't like it. I just ignored every nag that it gave me about updates. It's just not something I'm ever going to do.
Well, I've been enjoying Linux Mint 22, and recently the update came for 22.1, and I couldn't find a simple way to do it via the command line, so I just used the GUI updater. And that's what made me think of this question, because I just never use that. I always just use the command line to update. But at the same time, I was also messing with some partitions, and I realized that I always use gparted for that. I never, ever use the command line to edit partitions.
I agree. If I'm in parted, there's something very wrong.
I, again, flip, but yeah, I'm mostly graphical. I tell you, on any desktop environment, I will install KDE Partition Manager because you can live resize encrypted looks on LVM with a drag and drop, which is just brilliant for growing the partitions. So I did it recently. I cloned my work machine. The old one was 0.5 terabyte. The new one was 1 terabyte. I imaged one drive to the other, and then I just expanded it with literally dragging a mouse. And I was on XFCE, so I installed Partition Manager, the package, and then I just purged it and got rid of all of the KDE cruft that it pulled in. But it is really, really well done for a graphical way to do that. Shrinking, you're in the terminal again. You have to start doing all of the LVM resize and calculate the block size and do stuff like that. But expanding, which is my more common use case, you upgrade a machine, get more space, is absolutely brilliant at that.
GNOME disk utility is also really good for the task, and it's something that I use a lot, especially with, well, here we go again, especially with my framework, where sometimes it just decides not to mount USB storage. It'll either be me going to dmessage or opening up GNOME disks to figure out if the thing actually came up or not.
Here's a question for you, because you run modern distributions that were released in the last few years. I use it too, but it doesn't give you the smart output for NVMe drives. For SATA SSDs and spinning Rust, you can go to a graphical representation of the smart output, but you have to drop to a terminal and do smart CTL for the device. Have you seen it do that for NVMe in the graphical version in newer releases?
Well, let me try that right now. Where do I go to do it?
We're doing it live.
Oh, the fan's going to spin up now and ruin my day.
No. Smart Data and Self-Tests is grayed out on this device.
I'm assuming this is coming in a future release because it is the most common drive form factor, surely now.
There was a beautiful yet small period of time where you were able to do secure erase on SSDs from the disk manager, but that's gone now. Or maybe it only works if you have like one single command out of the 15 different commands you can use to do it. This is a place where I advertise Universal Superbox / Boomstick on GitLab and whatever.
I think for me, there are a handful of things that I maybe do in the command line at this point. So I'll always do htop. I'll always do dd and things in the command line rather than using Etcher or some GUI disk writer thing. But for the most part, like software updates, I have to do those through the App Store on the Mac.
They've got to him. Apple have got to him.
I know, I've been fully assimilated. And I guess I use it for brew and things like that. Oh, and speed tests, weirdly, I always do through the speed test CLI as well, because that just feels a bit nicer to me. Open up a terminal, speed test, rather than going to a website to do that.
I sometimes use the fast snap for that.
I didn't even know they had one. I'll have to look it up.
Yeah, just type fast, boom, done.
There's a script I use from OpenWRT for that, which is like better speed test. It's a bash script and it runs an HP application. God, I'd never remember what it actually does, but it runs concurrent streams down to and from the internet, and it's very good. So that's what I always use. But that's from when I was running my business, because it would really allow me to stress test the connection more than a lot of the other ones. There are some that test for buffer bloat and things like that. But so there is a netperf server that it connects to, and then you can do all sorts of flags for it. And I've carried that with me for years. So I do that in the terminal as well.
I actually did used to use Links, but LINKS, which I think is like a graphical terminal-based browser to look at AWS documentation and things. If I just wanted an IDE and a distraction-free way of reading documentation, which is probably a little bit of a weird thing to do.
I think when Gary said about HTOP and top as well, I tend to use headless stuff for that. I would never open up, I'm looking now on my desktop, the XFC Task Manager, I never open that. It's always top or HTOP that I use for that kind of thing. But again, that betrays work because we're running purely headless all the time. And part of our job is working out what's going on. So PS tree, the processes, grepping processes out, looking at HTOP or top. So obviously now when I want to do it at home, I automatically do the same thing.
Yeah, and equally killing processes and applications. Like when I'm on a Linux box, I always do xkill or kill. I very rarely try and do that through the GUI either.
Interesting. I always use Mate System Monitor for that.
No, just xkill, click the thing, done.
I usually reboot the machine.
There's a pattern emerging here. As someone who quite often uses Windows, I can see why you might have that mindset.
Yeah, really. You know, if something is going wrong with the computer, you just turn it off and on again. It'll probably work again.
Honestly, now, in the days of NVMe, it really isn't painful to reboot a machine, is it? Gone are the days of the absolute fear of having to reboot your machine and wait for it to come back up. Like, I never think about that and worry.
Well, it's like how my machines are either off or on and I never sleep them. Because of NVMe, it just boots so quickly. And it forces me to not hoard tabs like I do on my phone.
I mean, you could do restore session and then you could absolutely still be hoarding tabs.
I've had too many bad experiences with that where I did have a load of tabs that I wanted to keep and then it just didn't work.
That's reminded me that when I first played with Plasma the most recent time, I didn't realize the default was to just load everything that had been loaded before. And I put Conky on my desktop and I put it as an auto start, right? And after a few times of booting the machine up, I was like, why is it getting so thick? Like, the font is really thick and like overlaid and bold. It's just X11 as well. And I was like, there's like 50 conkeys laying over the top. So yeah, don't appreciate that. You know, all of these Macs with their hybrid sleep and stuff, I'm so used to it. As you said, Joe, I never worry, I wish I could just like grab my laptop and run to the coffee shop or whatever, and then it's just everything's there. No, I just turn it off, turn it on again and do everything else.
All right, don't bully me.
I got into that habit when I started doing full disk encryption. So, you know, old habits die hard.
Leonard's got your back because he's reinvented that and everyone's saved, right?
I hope so. Sincerely.
No, it does sound good, but there's always baggage, isn't there?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think it's a good idea because we don't have a good, secure way to do that at the moment. You're suspended to RAM without systemd homed, then if security is a concern, you're negating it. So you are right in all seriousness. I'm being a bit facetious.
Of course, it doesn't help that my laptop only lasts for 12 hours in sleep anyway.
Oh, drain?
Dab on the framework again.
Well, I don't understand the problem. I can just go to iCloud and click remote wipe. Problem solved.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by people who support us with PayPal and Patreon. Go to linuxafterdark.net/support for details of how you can support us too. Patreon supporters have the option to listen to episodes without ads like this. And it's not just this show. There's Late Night Linux for news, discoveries, audience input, and misanthropy, 2.5 admins about system administration, Linux Matters for upbeat, family-friendly adventures, Linux Dev Time about developing with and for Linux, Hybrid Cloud Show for everything private and public cloud, and Ask the Hosts for off-topic questions from you. You can even get some episodes a bit early. We've got a lot going on, and it's only possible because of the people who support us. So if you like what we do and can afford it, it would be great if you could support us too. At linuxafterdark.net/support. May, last episode we ran out of time. You were going to tell us about one of your wins.
Well, I was going to use the win that I was back on Linux, but that didn't last very long.
Oh.
But there were several wins there. So the reason why I was trying Linux again is because I heard that Discord has Wayland screen share support with audio for once. And it's taken them a long time to get there, so I really wanted to try it out. Unfortunately, It's not good. I hate to say it. But it doesn't use any QuickSync or AMD VCE, or I assume NVENC if you have that, to do video encoding. So it's really, really slow. I was getting maybe 2 frames per second when streaming a game.
And high CPU load when you're streaming a game is probably the last thing you want, right?
Oh yeah, it's really perfect. That's exactly why I bought a 5700X3D, was to encode the video of the game that I was currently playing. But that did present an opportunity. There is a project called Vencord, and they make Vesktop, which is very difficult to say out loud. That is a modded Electron client that loads up the web version of Discord and inserts a whole bunch of JavaScript. Very safe. That just actually makes Discord better in every single way, thereby continuing the trend of a bunch of furries, people with anime profile pictures, and other open source nerds, all of that said with full love for all of you, making better software than multi-million-dollar companies. So Vesktop, I signed right in. It was all fine. There were more options for how to do screen sharing. You can choose to prefer smoothness or prefer clarity, which is something that you can't do on the desktop version in Windows or anywhere else. And ultimately, it actually did make a good stream. It was actually using AMD VCE, which I was a little bit surprised by, after I got it set up correctly on Fedora, which is always a bit of a treat, depending on whether you're using Intel or AMD or, Lord forbid, NVIDIA.
Right, and so why didn't you stick with it?
I didn't stick with it because I bought a Valve Index over the holidays.
So the VR headset, right?
The VR headset, yep. And that's ultimately what killed it.
Because that's not one of the standalone ones like the Meta one. You need a computer to plug it into to drive it.
Correct. And actually, that was kind of the reason why I didn't get the Meta Quest, even though it is way better for the price. I cannot accept giving my data to Meta.
Yeah.
And of course, there's the option of Pico, but then you're just giving your data to Chinese Meta instead. So I got the Index. I used it with Windows, so I knew that the hardware was all working and like my room setup was okay, because I still have my old computer that I had just replaced. So that thing, it was working fine. And I thought, okay, now's the time. I'm going to take the challenge. I'm going to make this work on Linux. So all of the guides are now completely out of date because, I mean, no one cares about VR, especially not on Linux anymore, except for like those embedded people who do, mall displays of VR and stuff. It took me a few tries. You need to get the UDEV rules correct. I originally thought that it was a Linux-only issue. When I would start up Steam VR, it would say that the VR web helper crashed over and over again. But it turns out that's only because ABRT exists on Linux. It does the same thing on Windows, it just doesn't say anything.
What hardware is directly plugged into the computer to get it running?
So there's a cable called the Trident, which takes 3 different cables into one. It looks like a micro DisplayPort or something that actually goes to the headset.
Right.
So you plug in DisplayPort, USB 3.1, Gen 1, and power to get the headset running.
So you're docking your head, basically, to the machine.
I mean, it's called a head-mounted display for a reason. And then for the room, you also need to have lighthouses, which they aren't motion trackers, that's what they're kind of called, but all they really do is spin a laser light around to make a bunch of lines in your room so that based on the timing of when the lasers hit different points on the headset, it can tell where it is in the room. Same with the controllers. The controllers connect over something that doesn't seem to be Bluetooth directly to the headset. And once you have it all put together and do your room setup to say where your boundaries are, you get a rough approximation of virtual reality. But yeah, the real interesting part was getting it running on Linux because it wouldn't run correctly if run from directly under Steam. I had to go into the directory that SteamVR was installed in and manually run the scripts to run all of the different components of SteamVR. Because, yeah, if it was a child of Steam, it would just crash out, not work correctly, all of that. And once I finally got it running, I'm calling this a win for our Holiday Wins episode. By the by, because it was such a pain in the butt to get running. Once I finally did get the headset running, it worked. I played a game, but the tracking was almost always behind. There was always some, I'd almost describe it as motion blur, actually. where my movements were always a little bit behind where I actually was, both for the controllers and for the headset, and it was incredibly motion sickness inducing.
Yeah, that sounds like a nightmare. I daren't do any sort of VR anyway, even with low latency, because I get motion sickness really easily. So I just can't imagine how bad that must have been.
I mean, I have a pretty strong stomach, so that was surprising. It turns out there are different motion systems that you can use in VR games. Some of them are better, some of them are worse. I find that walking around with a joystick like you would in a regular game, and just treating it like a first-person game with 2 joysticks, ugh, nausea fest. Awful, terrible, would not recommend. But sometimes there's a teleport option where you kind of point to where you want to go, the screen fades out and back in where you want to go. That seems to work a lot better. And luckily my favorite game, Pistol Whip, for some reason, doesn't affect me at all, so I can play that as much as I want.
Is the Index officially supported on Linux by Valve or not?
It is. They only officially support Ubuntu, and I was using Fedora, so that was one problem. But also, there's not a lot of love going into the software on Linux. There's barely any love going into it on Windows as it is. However, one thing that I actually did win, I only got my firmware updates done because I had SteamVR installed on Linux. Every time I tried to start the firmware update on Windows, it would crash Steam out and then get really upset. But running everything in my super custom, I have run all the scripts myself, and I am the arbiter of what lives and what dies. I did actually manage to update the firmware of the controllers.
But you went back to Windows, right? Just to be able to use this, or just in general, you just wanted to go back?
Ultimately, yes. I mean, that's basically the only reason. I mean, if I was going to dual boot just for VR, I would end up not dual booting. I would just use Windows all the time. So it's just easier this way. And I mean, I have Windows 11 Pro, so I'm able to go into group policy and turn off all the things that I don't like, mostly. But yeah, it's just, I really miss everything happens instantly in Linux. There's no good way to explain the feeling of just hitting the super key and the thing you wanting to happen, happening instantly. Even on Windows now, they have screwed up the start menu to the point where you hit the Windows key and you wait a second. It just feels awful.
It doesn't matter what spec the machine is. You can have an incredibly powerful rig. It will delay as it tries to guess what you want to do, tries to serve you the wrong thing. When you start typing, it gives you one set of search results and then another. It is hateful.
It's so awful. Sometimes you will actually just type in update to go to Windows Update, and then it'll suddenly find the updater for some other application and say, you wanted that. Thanks.
Well, even though it didn't quite have a happy ending, I think you can still call it a win.
I did get it running. And yes, that is a win, considering how many hours I had to put into it.
Right, well, we'd better get out of here then. We'll be back in a couple of weeks, but until then, I've been Joe.
I've been Chris.
I've been Gary.
And I've been May.
See you later.